The topic of today's event is introducing Xenophile, Bibliopole, and Armorer, Chronopolis. It's a science fiction and fantasy bookstore in Richland, Washington. Our speakers are the owners of the store, Steven Woolfolk, who is a member of the Book Club of Washington. He's a physicist who has spent 50 years as a health physicist and radiological engineer, dealing with the management and disposal of nuclear waste, which is one reason why he ended up in Richland. I think he just told me that his 50 years has been spent mostly at a number of different sites west of the Mississippi, starting in Hanford and then ending in Hanford when he retired a few years ago to open a bookstore. Steven's been a collector for 50 years and has sold at a number of different conventions, book fairs, including the Seattle Book Fair, and now has transitioned to being a bookstore owner. And his partner is Brian Sheldon, who has been who had a bookstore in Richland called the Sheldon Library, which he had to close when he was redeployed as a military advisor to Iraq and Afghanistan. So he fortunately survived those deployments, came back, and he and Steven got together, and they will talk about it, I hope, about the building of their bookstore, which is quite large and is an all new structure. We were told about the bookstore by Linda Isaacson, who does the design and layout for our journal. Linda lives in Richland and was attracted to the extraordinary design and deep contents of this bookstore, as well as I think she enjoys the owners as well. So a few more things before we get started. I wanted to mention our next event is November 13. We're going to hear from two young rare book dealers in London. Jessica Starr of Jarndyce Antiquarian Booksellers and Ben Maggs of the venerable and legendary Knights Brothers Limited Bookstore. They will tell us about their experiences in the rare book trade in London. And I believe Tamara, who's on this call, I believe you've met them or heard them. This should be it should be a lot of fun to hear about how the kind of state of affairs in London. And my goodness, bookstores are still alive and well there. Our events for 2023 are taking shape, and we're going to announce them very shortly. One of the events will be we're going to do it jointly with the Baxter Club in Portland, Maine. They're celebrating their 40th anniversary, and we have just celebrated ours. So we're going to do joint 40th anniversary celebrations and talk about our respective clubs. So that should be interesting. I also wanted to mention some good news about the book club. At the recent Antiquarian Book Fair, we had our booth as usual, but what was not, and we usually add a few members at the book fair. This year, we've added about 14 new members, which is a very large increase for a club whose membership is at 114 members. And so we've substantially more than a 10% increase just in the last couple of weeks. I believe there may be a few of I can see one, Joe Gilliard is on this, is attending. I know he's one of the new members, and there may be others. So welcome, Joe. I think I'm ready to kind of turn this over to, well, I also want to thank our webmaster, Tim Schmidt, for helping facilitate this Zoom meeting. And he really does help our organization run smoothly, and has facilitated the presentation for Brian and Steven. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to them. We'll have a time for questions at the end. They can be, we're a small group. I think we'll just be able to raise hand and do it that way. I do see something in the chat right now, but let's see if that's, I just have, okay. Oh, you're welcome, Joe. Okay. Steve, I think, or Brian, Brian, you're going to be first. Is that it?
That's it.
Okay.
All right. I'm Brian Sheldon. Like you heard, I'm a former bookstore owner. Prior to that, I was a alternative high school teacher. But anyway, the bookstore is how Steve and I and our silent partner, Jesse, met. Was through my bookstore, and Steve came in and he was going through my antique fiction section looking for science fiction, which I thought was odd, but he had these reference books and he was identifying all sorts of books that I had no idea were science fiction. My background is in history and literature, so that's where I come in here. And then to keep my reading speed up, I read a lot of mysteries. Mysteries are mindless, so you can read fast and just keep on going. But anyway, the bookstore, how this particular bookstore came together, this is 6,000 square feet of bookstore. It would be bigger and we could easily fill it if the regulations didn't require some kind of fire suppression like sprinklers. Despite Fahrenheit 451, books do not burn well. We'll take our chances with fire. But like the Wicked Witch of the West, we are deathly afraid of water. So, but anyway, it's a large bookstore. My bookstore in Richland back in the 90s and early 2000s was only 4,000 square feet. And I thought that was a big bookstore. But anyway, while we have an extremely impressive science fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and horror section, we also have a lot of other material, our nonfiction. We have a paranormal section that is fairly impressive. We could probably become a paranormal store. But anyway, we started working on this in 2017. We started working on this. This was an empty lot in 2017. And then Steve and I and about 5 other friends built this from scratch, took it all the way up. This is a pole building. And it was interesting to me because my last job in the military overseas was I was a construction supervisor with the Corps of Engineers. And I had no actual construction. I was supervising, I was the blind leading the blind in Afghanistan. But anyway, learning how to build a building from scratch was quite interesting. What we were going for, if you go to our website, you can, at the bottom of the page, there's a walking tour, a virtual tour, and you can walk through the entire bookstore as it was in February. And if you do that because it's a lot cleaner. There's a lot less cat hair in February than there is now. But anyway, we started working on this in seriously in 2018 and finally finished enough to open in December of 2019. We opened on Friday the 13th, and about March, because of the COVID, we were forced to, we discovered that bookstores are not essential, according to the state of Washington. So we were closed, and we reopened again on Friday the 13th in November of that year. And then we've been, it's been difficult figuring out the advertising to get, because the world has changed quite a bit since you got an ad in the local phone yellow pages, and found the little print store, or the print advertising. It took us 6 or 7 months to convince the local newspaper that we were serious about wanting to advertise with them. I think they were shocked. But interestingly enough, with the newspaper industry, we actually, the person who handles our account is in San Bernardino in California. Yeah. And the layout and everything for the newspaper is all done in California. So on the local news, it's a day or two late because of the layout. But anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about our silent partner. Jesse Robinson is another collector. The whole bookstore is 3 lifetimes of collecting. Steve and Jesse are a little bit older than I am, so they got about a 10-year head start on me. And they're much more interested in the fantasy and the science fiction. But anyway, Jesse collected books. He actually, when I opened up my bookstore, it was a little tiny bookstore in Richland. And within an hour, he was in my bookstore and he wouldn't leave. So I eventually hired him. But anyway, through him, I met Steve. And then we had always talked about having a bookstore, but unfortunately, Jesse passed away in 2016 before we could get to this point. And so what we ended up doing is, all his books are in here. But what we ended up doing is scattering his ashes underneath the front door. And then we put his cane and a few of his poetry books that he wrote his own poetry in the wall, so that if he's up in heaven, or God forbid in hell, he can brag that he's got printed poetry in a bookstore. So literally in a bookstore. But anyway, and then Steve and I, this worked out really well. I got to spend most of COVID away, because I just retired and my wife wasn't quite ready for me to retire yet. And with COVID being stuck in the house, I may have not lived. But anyway, this gave me an outlet, and it's been a lot of fun. Steve is the brains, and the majority of the collection in here is Steve, but I'm, it's scary to say this, I'm the brawn of this organization. I do the grunt work, and I'm sort of like a curator. And speaking of curation, one of the things that we have in here that's interesting is we have a conference room open to the public. And I think, let me see if I can find it. There it is. There. It's open to the public, and the things in there are not for sale. Ironically, if you walk through the tour, everything you see, except for the stuff in the conference room, is literally for sale. We may or may not have priced it yet, but we're willing to sell it to you. But anyway, the conference room has a mini Manhattan Project museum. And we've been slowly, we collected items, local history and stuff over the years, but we're slowly getting the public recognition, and we've been had several really nice donations. An estate donated the the local newspapers from August of 1945, which are super important for the Manhattan Project here, because the people that built the bomb had no idea that they were building a bomb. They just knew they were doing something for the war effort. But we've also picked up some other things. But anyway, the curation, I'm trying to make it look like a respectable small museum. The other thing that we have is a really nice collection of local history and some of the foundation documents for some of the histories. Some of the local historians, we have their original manuscripts and dissertations. Let's see. I need to go back. This is right inside the door. It gives you an idea of the scope of the store. One of the nice things that we did in the store is we made as much of it as possible 48-inch aisleways to make it a little bit, what bookstore people tend to do is make the aisles as cramped as possible to get more space. We could have gotten about, two more aisles in each side just by making them nice and cramped. But we're committed now. We're not moving anything. The entire left side of the bookstore is science fiction with a little bit of classics stuffed in the very back corner. And to mix it up, about halfway down the aisleway on the left is a aisle full of original movie posters. There's maybe 1,000 of them on display, which is a small fraction of what we have. And then another thing that we do sell, Steve over the years has collected a lot of science fiction toys, games, play sets, etc., like that. And we have a really neat collection. Just walking through the store is amazing. It's an overload. There are so many different things. Steve has Edison record players set up. We have old reel-to-reel tape decks, VHS tape. There's a big section in the back full of the disc records, laser disc movies, that kind of thing. It's very eclectic. It's a very unique a unique store. What we have, as you can see, those are the different areas that we have. We have a very substantial paranormal section, and our mythology and folklore section is pretty respectable as well. These are one of the front areas up there, and it is some of the more unique paperbacks, chapbooks, pulps, and different type stuff. Steve will go more into detail. If you look up at the top, there is books, flip books, and those are full of ephemera and all sorts of different the stuff that you can't shelve well. One thing, people are always asking us about comic books, and while we collect comics, we only have one of each one, and comics are really hard to display. They take up a lot of space for display. So we haven't gotten to do any of that at this point. But this is the heart. We make the claim that we have one of the best science fiction, horror, and fantasy collections for sale on in the Pacific Northwest. I say in the country, but Steve is more conservative than I. But anyway, if you see these boxes, these at the back, they're filled with pulps and digests and science fiction magazines going back mostly to the 30s, 40s and up. But there's representative of the 20s and etc. But we have 3 of these cases full of those, and we have a lot of the 70s or the 80s and 90s digests out in storage at this point. I already talked about the conference room. And then these are the, on the left is the rare book room. These for books that are more expensive. Unlike a regular used bookstore where you walk in and pick up a paperback, it's priced on its value online and in the open market. So you occasionally get a surprise at the prices. But the more expensive books we've segregated out, and that's our rare book room. It's 10 feet by 10 feet. But we've overran that. So in the right is a cabinet filled with the nonfiction rare books. Some of the cool books that we have are, we have a very nice Asimov and collection of first editions. We have a really nice Bradbury, Heinlein, Herbert. We have a really impressive collection of first editions. We have a Princess Bride. I always tell people that we could have had a lot of Princess Brides, but we never knew how to identify. Every one I've ever seen, I thought was a second printing. And then it appears that I've been seeing first edition Princess Brides all along. But anyway, in the if you look over on the shelf in the back, on the top left, those are all books in Latin from the 16 and 1700s. Those came out of Europe back in the 50s or 60s, and it eventually got into our possession. And then in the nonfiction, a couple of the cool books that we have over there, Steve has a book. It's a part of a set of Alexander Pope, but inside it has a book plate, and it was in the personal library of the commander of the Boston Massacre, the British commander of the Boston Massacre. Has his book plate in it. In our area here, we have a lot of back in the 50s and 60s, John Birch Society. So we have a lot of that conspiracy type material in the bookstore. I'm trying to think. We have a first edition Hemingway that was bound in leather. I think there's 5 or 6 of them in existence. I think I'm getting into your area.
Not yet.
Yeah,
Right there.
But anyway, the bookstore. Another interesting thing that we've had to happen is we've been approached by the B Reactor Museum Association, and they were having difficulty selling souvenirs and related material because the national park, the Manhattan National Park, actually resides on DOE building. It's a rented building, but the DOE doesn't allow any kind of retail activity. So their retailer went out of business that was helping them. And so they approached us. They're just around the corner from us. And they approached us and they asked us if they could display their souvenirs. So they do about 10 tours each week. And we lost about 11 feet of display space. However, we've been getting probably about 20 people in the morning and 20 people in the afternoon, most days of the week, that would normally not have seen our bookstore. And so it's been a real symbiotic relationship between us and the B Reactor Museum. And if you're ever in this area, there's 2 really nice tours at the national park out there. and we have some co-related display material. But I can babble forever, and I think I have so far. But anyway, I'm going to pass it over. Steve is the expert on science fiction. Like I said, the first time I met him, he was going through old antique fiction, looking for science fiction that I had no idea existed. But anyway, without further ado, Mr. Steven Woolfolk.
Basically, we do emphasize science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and it always has been a place where, when I go to the antiquarian bookshops, I always found that they always thought that entire subject was kind of strange, and I was sort of out of place. But here's some of the stuff we have, and some of the stuff that I was always looking for and couldn't afford and to find. But science fiction is assumed to start for science fiction people with Mary Shelley. Before that, people like Sir Thomas More's Utopia and Spenser's Fairy Queen existed, plus all the mythology, the oral histories like Beowulf, and the Gothic novels were all out there, the supernatural novels, and they all sort of are the predecessors that lead into science fiction. But the speculative fiction sort of started with Mary Shelley and her works. We have a lot of early Gothic novels. You can see some of them opened out here. I have some examples of them. Excuse me, I got in a hurry. You can even see a few of them are yellowbacks, the yellowback books from the 1800s, but they basically predate Mary Shelley, or they're reprintings of stuff from that predate Mary Shelley and tend to be supernatural or horror-based material. Sort of the first major science fiction person was, of course, Jules Verne. We have a fairly decent collection of Jules Verne. We have some of the early magazine publications like Lakeside and Seaside. We have a lot of first editions. And if you look over to the right, those bottom two rows are the Arco Vernes, which may be true kind of weird first editions, in that the original first editions of Verne were very anglicized by the British publishing firms and then copied by the American publishing firms. And so sometimes the Arcos are really closer to what originally Verne had written versus what the publishers decided to anglicize to. Then another major person who's been forgotten now to a large extent was George Griffith, and he wrote a whole lot of science fiction-y type novels there between Wells and Verne, and he's sort of a forgotten person that we also kind of keep track of. And then Wells is the next big author that really played things major. I had when I bought my top copy of Time Machine the first time, was at work and it arrived, and one of the people asked me, why would I buy a book that cost that much money and didn't look all that exciting? And I told him I thought I was holding on to a piece of history of history right there, because that changed society to some extent. The whole concept of time travel was something that came out of what Mr. Wells did. And we have a fair amount of Wells, a lot of it in the rare book room. Here you can see the early science fiction bound books, Lucian, Walpole, and a lot of the various items. And then one of the things that seems to have been forgotten to a large extent by a lot of science fiction collectors even is that in the 1860s, America had a major science fiction writers, but they weren't in the hardback books. They were in the dime novels. And Ellis wrote probably the first major robot story back in, 1868, The Steam Man of the Plains, or the Prairies, depending on which version you happen to buy. And it was published by American Novel Company. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it. It's super, super rare, but I have the reprints of it that were done by various people after that, because the dime novel people kept reprinting everything over and over again. And then Frank Reed and with the author No Name, which is actually Louis Theron, censor. Well, anyway, he was the he continued on, picked up the Steam Man of the Plains and did the Frank Reed and Jack Wright stuff, or Frank Reed stuff. And he actually corresponded regularly with Verne. They actually were discussed things with each other about science fiction. But there are robots going on from about 1860, the 1860s on, late 1860s on in the United States, robot stories, and that kind of predate RUR and all the things that we normally think of as the robot stories. And they don't seem to be really well known even to the science fiction collectors. There is a lot of science fiction that was done in dime novels, a lot of Lost Race stuff, a few Mars things. You see a lot of Jack Reed, Frank Wright, and then you'll begin to see the other publishers showing up like Haggard and Hodgson and Verne and Wells in the paper wrapped books that they evolved into. One of the things I do point out to people is that paperback books started out as a pocketbook item, but didn't last very long because of that, because various library associations around the country came to the conclusion that dime novels were leading the children away from reading the proper kind of books, and lobbied the postal department to make it expensive to ship them. And that's why most of the dime novels you see look like magazines. The format was altered so they could legally ship them at a lower rate. And you think of the librarians as somebody who always wanted people to read, but not always. Back then, they really didn't like the idea of science, of the dime novels. And then they're all during this same period, all the chapbooks were coming out. One of the major ones was the Battle of Dorking. It's a famous story. It was probably published by Blackwood. The Battle of Dorking projects in 1871 that Germany invades and takes over England. Mr. Gladstone turned out not to appreciate that because it became a major thing in politics at the time. And as you can see here, there are a number of books all responding back to that same book, and actually got published in the United States and became a major political issue. But you begin to see, like, here's a very early 1800s Gothic type thing from England, and there's all sorts of small chapbooks. All of these things are science fiction and sort of out there. You see them in reference books. You rarely see them for real. And that's just another view, and you begin to see some of the others. There's also some Toshnet stuff here that publisher that published for the railroads in Europe in English. That did a lot of the science fiction books, Vernon Wells in particular. And then as the dime novels died, they went to the paper wrap books, and you begin to see all the libraries and all the specialty publishers publishing their paper wrap books. And there's a lot of science fiction in that nature. Hodgson and Cook, Wells and Verne, Marsh, all figure significantly. And then science fiction sort of evolved after that into the slicks. They were basically in the mainstream magazines, and you began to see them showing up in a lot of different magazines. This is the one with a really great Rousseau cover about a man in a cryogenic chamber. I mean, everybody, but Cosmopolitan published most of the works of Wells that were science fiction, but they showed up in all of these various magazines that were being published there in the 1800s. And then the pulp took over for science fiction, and most science fiction got published in the pulps and not elsewhere. And the first pulp that started publishing science fiction was Thrill Book. I once owned a copy of it. I traded it to a guy who was completing his collection because he had all of them. It was only published in 1919. It's Thrill Book. It typically only had one or two science fiction stories in it, but then things like Weird Tales began. And as you can see, Weird Tales is a science fiction magazine that started in 1923, and I don't know when it ends. It's died several times over history and been reborn. Here's the pulps that ran all the way up into the 50s, and then it died, and then it was reborn in a digests, and then it was reborn in a stapled magazine. Then it was reborn in a slick magazine, and it was reborn into a bound magazine, and even issued in hardbacks. Every time you think it's dead, somebody gives it rebirth, and it starts over again. So I'm not sure whether it's done or not. It seems to go on forever. During the same time as the Weird Tales was coming out, Hugo Gernsback was an inventor and scientist and entrepreneur in New York, and he started publishing in his Modern Electric magazine back in 1908, science fiction stories. And his first story appeared in 1911. This is and this was where he published Ralph 1, 2, 3, 4. That's not the right number, but and then basically he then published Modern Electric and Science and Inventions, and occasionally include fiction stories, and found them to be profitable. So in 1926, he started Amazing Stories, and Amazing Stories was to be one of the major science fiction magazines. It ran from 1926 to the into the 60s, through the 60s, and sort of died in the 70s. Now, he had a problem. Mr. Gernsback was not a great businessman. Like he was also trying to broadcast TV back in the 20s in New York City, and he ended up getting into trouble and losing his magazine to other publishers. And so then he went out and started Wonder Stories. Excuse me, I shouldn't have clicked that. And Wonder Stories was basically continued on while Amazing continued on. And both of these magazines were big movers in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. The newsstands would have had them all over the place every month. And then John Campbell's magazine, Astounding Stories, started in 1930 and started doing the more hardcore science fiction. And science fiction sort of evolved there. That's where a lot of the authors that were to become important in the 60s and 70s started out in the 40s and 50s. But this was the higher quality science fiction. Amazing Stories always was trying to publish things on the cheap. I should probably mention that Weird Tales, that's where the people where Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, who wrote the Conan stuff, Clark Ashton Smith, Hodgson, they were all published there originally, along with some of their spin-off magazines. Also during this time, Argosy started evolving into a major science fiction source as well. This is where Argosy, All Stories, and Cavalier, they're all related. They slowly evolve into each other, and then eventually all evolve to become just Argosy. But aside from Blue Book, which was a separate magazine, but Tarzan and the Burroughs stuff all came out in Argosy and was a major pulp source as well. These magazines get their name from the fact they were made with pulp paper, and the paper is horrible. It easily shatters if it's not kept well, and the magazines are very fragile anymore. You have to treat them with significant care, and they're basically a whole group of people out there collect them, but they tend to be very specialty people. And in addition to the major ones I've mentioned, there were all sorts of other ones, like Planet Stories did lots of hardcore science fiction from 39 to 55, and Famous Fantastic Mysteries reprinted all of the science fiction stories that had already been printed from 39 to 53. And you can begin to see some of the titles that were out there. some of the really unusual. Dr. Death is a rather unusual magazine, like Oriental Stories and Magic Carpet, but there were all sorts of them. Unknown tended to be on the horror side. You can see some of the digest magazines. Eventually, at about 1950, all of the pulp slowly turned into digest magazines. They basically decreased their size and became digest. You can see down here along the bottom row are some really nice digests. I should have focused in more on that, and you can see them a little better. And here's some more of the digest. You can begin to see these are Marvel Tales. Excuse me. The Marvel Tales basically was sort of a borderline magazine that was almost a fanzine instead of a digest magazine or a pulp. Was one of the ones that had relatively low runs. And then the British were doing this at the same time. You saw a lot of the same titles in Britain, but there was also Fantasy Tales, and then there was Scoops. Scoops was a special two-penny dreadful. Ran until in 34. It's very famous. You see it regularly at in the books on illustrations of science fiction, and then there were lots of others like these here and fantasy. Also, Boys Friends Library published a lot of stuff in a slightly smaller format, doing a whole lot of boys' books, and about 1 out of every 50 was science fiction. Then there's a number of those as well. And then other countries also did them, but they tended to be later. This stuff is the Australian versions. They're very, very short, almost they are chapbooks almost. But they basically printed American stories or other stories, and they're rather unusual. They tended to be in the 50s with the other digests. And you can see some of the American digests here. That's what is right along here. Now, in addition to what was going on with the pulps, of course, the science fiction hardbacks were coming out, and the science fiction hardbacks were a little different in that one of the big things was it tended to be small publishers. A lot of small publishers published science fiction hardbacks. Here's Stanley Weinbaum's Dawn of Flame. It was a one-shot by a publisher. This is a set of signatures from William Cook, who published The Shunned House by Lovecraft. And when he published it, he only bound a few copies. And then he gave away some of the sets of signatures, and then he sold all the rest of the signatures to Argus Derleth, who eventually published them as part of Arkham House. And here's a Visionary Press, an early Lovecraft book. These were all really small publishers. Basically, they tended to be publishing just for the purposes of publishing the book they wanted to publish. And then Derleth creates Arkham House, and Arkham House was originally planned to publish the works of Lovecraft. That was its big emphasis. And its first publication was Outsider. But they also sold sets of signatures for The Shunned House that they bought from Cook and mailed them out. And this has the envelope from Arkham, and actually is a set of signatures they sold. They would eventually publish this in their rarest book, The Shunned House, which is the one that didn't have a dust jacket. You begin to see some of the major people who that Arkham eventually went ahead and published, like there's the Lovecraft stuff, Beyond the Wall of Sleep, and Outsider, and Howard's Skullface, and Hodson's House on the Borderland, Bradbury's Dark Carnival, down here's Dark Chateau by Clark Ashton Smith, Derleth, someone, and then there's also Out of Space and Time by Clark Ashton Smith and Opener of the Way by Block. All of these people were being published, and Arkham still had basically is still kind of surviving, but it's always been a horror publisher, which started out for the purposes of publishing H.P. Lovecraft because people wanted to get him published. The science fiction thing also had a lot of other publishers in it, like Gnome. Here's some of the Gnome books. They published The Foundation. They published iRobot. They published Heinlein. They were a major science fiction publisher. They also published all of the Howards and also the early Nortons. This book right here is out of place because I put it in here because it's an interesting book to see. This is the British Conan compared to the American Conans. And it's a Boardman. The Boardman did a bunch of science fiction at the same time. But Gnome was a major specialty press that dealt with science fiction. One of the other specialty presses was Fantasy Press. They did a lot of different authors. They did a lot of the Doc Smith. They did Campbell, Everett, Heinlein. This is a special Fantasy Press. Fantasy Press almost always came out the first time you could buy a signed limited edition. And in the signed limited edition, it was signed and it was bound in the book and numbered. For those of you who are familiar with science fiction, you may have heard of Forrest Ackerman, but he was considered science fiction fan number one of the most famous science fiction fans. And this is actually a copy from his library. And when Fantasy Press found it, they assigned him number 4F for Forey. And this is actually signed to Forey with a specific inscription by the author. And Ackerman was the person who did famous Monsters of Filmdom and things of that nature. Over here is FPCI. FPCI also was a fantasy press publisher, but it was based in Los Angeles. It was a little rougher production, not as much quality. They published things that other publishers, small press publishers, didn't want to publish. They always had small print runs, and they also almost always sold their books as hardback and paperback. The paperback just took the dust jacket, took the signatures, wrapped them with cardboard, and then put a dust jacket on them. And he would, before he would go to a science fiction convention, he'd go buy some cardboard, print it, and they keep changing colors because he would bind them for each convention before he would go. So when you talk about different states, you always have a problem with him. And then there's also Shasta. Shasta did a number of early people, as well as Prime and Hadley and Buffalo and FFF, which is a fan publishing thing. Here are Bester, these Bach, Leinster, Jones publication and the Leinster publication. A number of Heinlein books. This is a E.E. Smith book, and Hadley and Buffalo printed the E.E. Smith books. Prime published a number of books as well. Some signed limited editions. It also published the Wolf Leader by Dumas, which hadn't been in print, and then This Is It by Theodore Sturgeon. It's only about 25 pages long. It was a pamphlet. It was only given out at a convention. It's one of the rare science fiction books that floats around. That's a Prime Press. But all of these small publishers sort of began the rapid publication of science fiction. And then the the big modern publishers began to take over, and one of the publishers was Winston, and they did a whole science fiction series. And there are people who collect these. They tend to be juveniles in a lot of ways, but they all are very distinctive, and a lot of people are interested in them. But they were a major producer of science fiction for a short time. Between 1950 and 1960, a whole bunch of authors started popping up suddenly into science fiction. These are the authors we mostly know about today. The ones with an asterisk had a few stories published, a small fraction of their publications in the pulps, but most of it showed up in the digests and in the mainstream publishers that followed. The ones with the double asterisks are actually people who were published primarily in the pulps. That would be Weinbaum, and the people mentioned here, Burroughs and Howard and Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Jules Verne, and H.G. Wells. These people were from the 20s, 30s, and 40s more, and were pulp publishers. These others are the mainstream publishers, the people we recognize today as the major contributors to science fiction, like Heinlein, Herbert, Asimov, Silverberg, Moorcock, Farmer, Zelazny, Jack Vance, Bradbury, Clark, Samuel Delany, Philip K. Dick, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. These people were all publishing and became the dominant force for science fiction, and the big increase in science fiction during the 50s and 60s. Here's some examples of some of those editions. You see RUR's there, all the Bradburys are there. You have Clark and Asimov. There's the Philip K. Dick book, that's Doubleday. Tolkien, Dick, Roger Zelazny, Canticle for Leibowitz by Miller. All of these were mainstream publishers, and all of this is really 50s and 60s publication. Then you see the mainstream publishers begin to dump stuff out. This is basically just some pictures of our shelves showing you the kind of stuff we have. This is actually a cart completely full of Norton on one side. Andrea Norton is so big we don't even put her on the shelf. We put her on a book cart of her own. But Heinlein, in addition to the stuff in the rare book room, we have shelves full, but you see all of the assortment of publishers, all the modern publishers, and continuing on, you basically just see the various authors. You see people like Avalon and Doubleday and Chilton's and Dial and Ace, and everybody was publishing science fiction by then. By the 60s, the mainstream publishers took over from the small press publishers. They also tended to show up quite often. The first editions were published by the paperback people instead of the hardback people. The classic example is Ringworld, where the paperback edition was out for several years before the hardback showed up. But these are some of the major publishers you see. Also, they published quite a few things in digest. The digest used to be relatively small, short runs, like the Avon Fantasy Reader and things of that nature. The British also did this. They did the digest. Most of their stuff there was a lot of digests in the 50s. Then the Penguin was a big publisher for everything. Badger is the equivalent of the American Ace paperback. Ace published huge amounts of science fiction in the 50s and 60s, and Badger did the same thing in England for the English writers. And there are the Australians are there also, obviously. Here's a picture from our case showing just some of the things, the paperbacks. That's a Philip Jose Farmer by Essex House. And let's see, what do we got there? There's the Lovecraft Bard House. This is an Armed Services edition This is probably one of the rarer and more valuable paperbacks you'll see. This is a copy of Junkie. It was a Ace double, published as William Lee by Ace, and it's one of the rarest, most valuable borderline science fiction paperbacks. That one is probably as pristine as any copy you'll ever see. And down here below, by the way, happens to be, those are dime novels in their original format. But you can begin to see what you actually have. I got in a rush. In publishing in paperbacks, here's a shelf of just the Burroughs stuff and the ends of some of the A's, but they're just all sorts of publishers, all of the different publishers published them. It was just sort of an ongoing thing, and it was a major market. All of these tend to be collectible, not super valuable. And here's the classic Ace doubles that people talk about. These were all 50s and 60s things. They basically had books on two sides. You flip the book over and read it from both ends, so that they could put two stories in there. They're slightly inconvenient in a bookstore in that you have to put them separately because you can't sort them by author, but that's always an interesting phenomenon. We also have some really odd things like these are the Armed Services Edition paperbacks that were created in the 1945 during the Second World War and were actually given to soldiers. Now, these were never sold. They were basically bound on the opposite side so they fit in their pocket well, and the corporations and the authors didn't get any royalties out of this. It was basically just for the war effort. Here you see the Badger books, the British Badger books that are like the Ace. There's about 200 of these different science fiction titles. And here's the second iteration of the doubles books. This is the Tor doubles, and they were like that. They tried to imitate the Ace doubles from the past. And as you can see, science fiction in the 70s and 80s went into a major boom and became a major source of publishing. There were always more books than you could possibly buy. And they were from every publisher seemed to have some science fiction, some publishers more than others, but everybody had major authors and they were all being published. There are specialty publishers still around like Grant, who published, this is just a card of Grant Conan's right here. They published all sorts of the older science fiction for people as well during this period. And one of the phenomenons that occur when with the publishing of science fiction and other books is what's often referred to as hypermoderns. And I always think of this as the first hypermodern right here. Roger Zelazny published a book called The Lord of Light. It was a very good book. But he also had published Creatures of Light and Darkness, which wasn't selling very well for Doubleday. And Doubleday told one of the workers in the warehouse to pulp the Zelazny book because it wasn't selling. And unfortunately, he pulped Creatures of Light and Darkness The Lord of Light instead of Creatures of Light and Darkness. And so this became one of the more valuable books during this period, simply because they went in and destroyed most of the copies. And so there were very few copies generated. But then with the other, as the market continues now, in our current market, you have books like, this is The Wheel of Time. This is a hypermodern book, what I would call a hypermodern book, because when they published The Wheel of Time, the publishers did some hardbacks for Jordan, but they didn't think it was going to go anywhere, so they made very few copies. And now this is a very valuable book, and yet it's not very old. It's fairly recent. What we find, a similar thing occurred with the Game of Thrones. There was not expected to be a great famous book when it was published. They thought it was just another Martin. And it went up initially, and then when the movie came out, it went completely out of sight. The Stand was like that. It was another one that jumped up real fast because suddenly everybody wanted it, and the print runs were very low. Some of the butchers have begun to do the same thing. Some of the Patty Briggs books have also done some of the same things. Also, Lou, The Three Body Problem, when he won the Hugo Award, suddenly you just simply couldn't buy this book. Now it's extremely valuable, yet it's not very old. It's very recent. Erickson is another author that tends to do that. And one of the other phenomenons we're seeing, and we're buying books to take it into account, is the limited press publishing that's going on now. It helps to expand our options. Whoop, excuse me, I didn't want to go there. Subterranean, PS, Cemetery Dance, Suntop, Centipede, and a lot of others. Often, like the Corey books that are here, which have some amazing dust jackets on them, and all of these others. But they'll arrive from the publisher to me with a list price on them, and the price in the marketplace is 3 to 5 times the value of the book by the time I receive it. And that's a brand new book, and yet that's it. It's just a different phenomenon. Probably will continue because they're sticking with limiting their number of books. They're not overproducing them, or at least Subterranean. So far, they haven't. Centipede is just a really high quality book, approaching maybe folio in quality. There are a number of other small publishers like this that have done well. And I think they're going to create another set of hypermoderns, the Martin books, the Corey books, the Carey books, the Butcher books, all of that, the Subterraneans from all of these things, and the PS or the Cemetery Dance or the Suntop tend to suddenly have a lot of value, and they seem to be holding it extremely well. They are very well-made books. Our bookstore also has a large collection of Patty Briggs's books. We try to have most everything she published. I'm now going out and finding the paperbacks where the dust jackets, the wrappers changed. But this is the manuscript for her first book, Mask, one of her rarer books. That's the first edition and the rewrite of it. But we have the manuscript. We have all of her her books. We had her come and come by and sign a bunch of books for us. And she put a picture of this cabinet on my on her website. And I sold all of my copies of her first 3 Mercy Thompson books the first day, and had for 3 or 4 weeks, we had people constantly sending us emails to buy those same books over and over again. But one person from Portland bought all 3 of her first books and the first Alpha series book as well, and basically paid $2,300, I think it was, or something like that. But I could have sold them over and over again. They basically suddenly, now these are really rare books in some cases. But we always thought it was interesting to have the actual manuscript for Mask. We have a manuscript for a Harlan Ellison book as well. We try and pick up things like that. We also probably need to emphasize the fact that in science fiction, you need to have your own reference system, because all of it is really unique and all sorts of special considerations. And there are the reference books themselves are quite often collectible. Right here is 333. There are people out there that only collect books mentioned in 333. That's the only books they want to buy, and they want all of them. Now, that's a really pricey issue because it's the really rare science fiction books. There's Day's Index of Science Fiction Magazines that does a lot of the science fiction magazines from 26 to 1950s. Voices Prophesizing War talks about the Battle of Dorking. But but all of these reference books are out there. They're available, but you really need them to identify what you got. Curry did some of the very first person to go in and point out that there are a number of science fiction books out there where the book club, science fiction book club book is the first edition. And then you have to know what the gutter code is and all the stuff about it to actually go find which one is the first. And he did he was one of the first people to point out a bunch of those that had occurred over the years. And that kind of wraps up the talk. I guess I'm not as long as I was supposed to be. We try and have a bookstore that supports everybody. As you can see here, we have a few pieces of cuneiform and hieroglyphics because it seemed important to at least acknowledge the beginnings of writing. And one of the things we do when people come to our bookstore is we give them a free book of matches. And then we ask them why we might have given them matches and point out the symbol on the front, which happens to be the symbol from the fire truck / salamander from the movie Fahrenheit 451. And most people agree that that's probably a relatively relevant point now. It's very nice to have a lot of people from lots of different political views admitting that they really are concerned about books and how people are treating them now and about the continuation of books. If you have any questions or I can be of any assistance or you're interested in something further, be quite willing to answer any questions or try and find the answers for you. Brian, do you have anything else? Okay, I guess I can turn it back to the moderator if I can.
Okay, well, I'll be that person right now. So thank you, Stephen and Brian. That was really terrific. I think it sounds like visiting your store is really is worth the trip to Richland, and we'll all have to get it on our itinerary someday when we get over that side of the mountains. Do you sell online as well?
We're getting ready to start selling online. I have one concern about that. I spent 50 years bringing all these books to Washington. And when I go in the rare book room and I look at it, and I think if I put it online, all of it will move to California and the East Coast. That always bothers me just a little bit. I have the same problem with my play sets that I collected. I have all the science fiction play sets from the 50s, 40s, and 50s and 60s. Put them online. They're all going east into California.
I see. Well, we appreciate your loyalty to the state of Washington and our area. So let's see what we can do to get people there. I think this is certainly a first step. I had no idea the depth of the field. I'm not really a science fiction writer, although I have to say that I did have a copy of Venus on the Half Shell.
Oh, Gilbert Trout.
Yes, and it had, I just looked it up again, and my copy, it had on the cover, it said first time in lurid covers. And the one that popped up on the internet didn't have that little line on there, which I thought was hilarious because it was always in lurid covers. I mean, all these things had. So that gets me to another kind of question, and that is the artists that were these are a lot of these books are heavily illustrated, or certainly their covers are. And so, are there particular artists that are collected in the field?
Oh yeah. Well, of course, the classic example I would give you, and that's because of a interesting event. Margaret Brundage is a lady artist in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That's not a time when ladies were artists, illustrators of science fiction magazines, but she started illustrating weird tales and completely dominated weird tales from about 1940 through the 50s until they moved to New York City. And then her pastels wouldn't travel and she wouldn't leave Chicago. So, but she's one of the major artists, but there's Finley, there's Paul, there's Alex Stromberg, But then you can go to the more modern people like Jean Dixon and her husband, Leo. But you can go to the people who are doing the illustrations now as well. But yeah, Virgil Finlay, Frank Frazetta. We have examples of some Frazetta art and things like that here. Boris. But yeah, all of the illustrators are collected. Typically, you tend to be looking for specific people. I tend to look for Finley and I look for Brundage. And I particularly like her art. I like the fact that she was doing it when no other women were doing it, and yet it's not. You wouldn't look at when you look at the cover, you do not think that was a woman artist. You think of it as just a good piece of art.
Yeah, right. Do I have any other questions here for Brian or
I
Steve?
wanted to mention, you know that Kilgore Trout Business on the Hash Shell is Philip Jose Farmer, right?
Yes. Well, it's funny. I just looked it up. I thought it was Kurt Vonnegut. Yeah, I thought it was Kurt Vonnegut had written it because it was Kurt, because Kilgore Trout's a character in Kurt Vonnegut books. But it was but Farmer had permission.
Yeah, he had permission, and then I understand Vonnegut regretted it after the fact. Farmer has done a number of pastiches like that for various authors.
I see. Okay, that's clever. Yeah, I just love the cover. Yeah, right. So let's see. It looks like somebody here. So Dan Trefethan says that Heritage Auctions just had a big sci-fi and fantasy sale from Harlan Ellison's collection.
Yeah, they just had it like a week ago. You could go online and look up the prices if you log into Heritage Auctions. So it'll make your eyes pop out. It's the original art from some of those signature artists just go for amazing amounts of money.
Yep.
I can't play
at
at that level.
Pieces like that, like Kelly Frias, we have a number of pieces here in the store, including one of his books. I have all of the pieces that went together to make the book cover. I have the book Gus jacket, and then all of the art. And it's really kind of interesting to see that.
It's all in overlays and stuff.
It's done
really
with
cool.
overlays. And then back from some of the Crawford stuff from FPCI, I actually have the printing plate and everything from some of that stuff, where he plated it, did it in the color separations and all of that stuff that had to be done to make the art. So I have the original art in some cases, and then all the pieces they did.
Interesting. That sounds like some of that you might not sell some of that stuff, but or it's like anything for sale.
It's for sale.
It's theoretically for sale, but the prices won't be cheap because I'm not encouraging somebody to take it away.
Yeah.
But then I've already had people buy things I didn't think they would take.
I see. Right. You thought, oh, they'll never pay that, but they did.
Yeah.
So, Steve, did you pretty much cut off your collecting with the 1980s, or are you still collecting contemporary?
No. You want an Erickson? I have them. I have them all signed. I say I would probably cut my collecting off in
Tuesday.
I don't think I've done any major purchases for the last 3 years.
Okay.
But no.
But again, we're trying to downsize. One of our motives is that we want our children to like us after we're dead. And if we die very soon, they're going to hate us.
They don't like moving boxes of books.
Yeah. Right.
And shipping containers of books.
Yeah. Corey and Lou and Erickson are two of the major people I have a lot of, and I think are some of the really great ones, along with McDivitt and Hamilton.
Oh yeah, okay. You're into big space opera stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Great.
Well, although Erickson is fantasy.
Well,
I
was thinking McDevitt and
the others. I do like Larry Niven. I consider one of the premier science fiction writers, and I think McDivitt or Hamilton may be his successor.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm pretty much a completist on Alistair Reynolds, who sort of picked up that mantle and is running with it. So, yeah. So, but I'm all over the map. I'm probably half science fiction, half fantasy. I follow the authors, not the genre. So I have a lot of Le Guin.
Yeah.
And a fair amount of contemporary fantasy, but not, I don't collect Patricia Briggs. I never got into Mercy Thompson.
Well,
But,
I had the problem. I read Mercy Thompson when I lived in Kennewick, and the places she was describing was right across the canal from where I was reading it.
Yeah, that's always an issue. Yeah, I told my wife when I got the email for this session, I told my wife, at the antiquarian bookstore or at the antiquarian book fair a few weeks ago, I bought from 4 different vendors. All of them were from Oregon. And I thought, I got to make a trip down south and then run up the river to your place, just make a circuit.
You're gonna have to go all the way down to Medford, because that's where is it, Grants Pass, where he lives. One of the I don't remember his name right this second, but he's one of the dealers that's really good.
Are you thinking of Robert Gavora in Talent?
Yeah.
Okay, from the first book I bought that really started my collection, I bought from Robert Gavora in 1988. It was a copy of first edition of Neuromancer.
Oh, okay.
So Bob Gavora sort of got me into this thing with William Gibson.
Are you familiar with Dick Wald?
I may have bought from him actually. Yeah, I'd have to look it
I
up.
blame Dick Wald for my problem with pulps.
Okay.
I was collecting comic books, and I went to comic book convention, and I hung out with Lance Casper and Dick Wald, and Lance Casper is sort of the father of paperback collecting.
Yeah.
And the next thing I know, I was selling off all my comic books and buying pulps and hardback books and paperbacks, and never went back.
Well, fortunately for my pocketbook, I don't collect pulps for the most part. Like I said, I don't really go back much further than the 1980s. I cherry pick a few titles, but mostly I'm not a strong collectible in things before I was reading. You probably know Dave Smith from Fantasy Illustrated up here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I get his catalog, but because I bought the serialization of Dune in analog, I bought that from him. And that's about it as far as pulps go. I don't really go into that, but I'll never be able to afford a first edition of Dune, the hardback. So the serialization was my.
But you can come and
my
visit.
consolation prize. I'm sure you do have them.
I'm always fascinated by the fact that I reached down and I pull up Spencer, and I say, I got a 1700s copy of Spencer's Fairy Queen here. Isn't this neat?
Yeah.
And then I say, and this is a long way from a first edition. The first edition is 1500.
Yeah.
And that fascinates me, the really old stuff that inspired all this.
Yeah, the oldest thing I got in my collection, I just looked it up, was a long time ago when I was out of college at this eclectic little bookstore that didn't specialize. I picked up a copy of The Worm of Robros, the E.R. Edison,
Yep.
the Jonathan Cape first edition, 1922.
Yeah.
And that's the oldest collectible book I've got. And it was just a one-off. It's like, what is this doing here? And it was reasonably priced. It doesn't have a dust jacket, but it's a good shape. So it was reasonably priced. And I'd read it and I liked it. It's sort of a hallmark of the fantasy field. So I picked it up. But otherwise I don't collect Edison or the old fantasy authors. Lord Dunsany or anybody like that.
Yeah, if you walk down my shelves, you can be walking down the shelf and looking at Erickson, well, not Erickson, because I have him in a special place because I have too many copies of his books. But an author like Erickson, and then right next to it, what's this old book here? And you pull it out, and it's an 1800s science fiction book by some author you've never heard of.
Right.
And they told a neat science fiction story back then, and you don't know about them, or a fantasy story. And the authors back in the 1800s, unless you go to Bleiler or Moscovitch, you can't find out anything about them. They're just not out there. Nobody knows what they are. That's what I was doing to Brian when he was saying I was going through his books. I was going through and looking for 1800 speculative science fiction that was written that weren't science fiction writers. They were people.
There was no marketing as such in that day for genre work. So, I guess the closest thing would be Gothic novels.
Yeah.
But other than that, you know, what we would call science fiction looked like just any other book, and often did not have a title that indicated it didn't have Mars or Venus in the title necessarily, so you wouldn't know it was science fiction.
It's very frustrating, and you have to learn to what authors to go look for, and sit there with a reference book, and then you find something that's not in the reference book, and you don't know what to do about that. But you have to read it and see if it really is science fiction.
But I
Well,
know you read the old stuff, Dan, but you should look at Heinlein.
Oh, I ripped
Yeah.
through Heinlein when I was in my teens.
I was going to
Yeah,
say,
science fiction collectors all have read
he's
Heinlein.
my favorite of all.
No, I did my ABCs: Asimov, Bradbury, Clark, and then a helping of Heinlein. Okay, I went through.
Yeah, I'm just saying, you said you only did new ones. So.
Well, you know, I can't afford the signature Heinleins and Asimovs anymore. You know, that copy of Foundation you've got there, that's at least a 4-figure copy, and I don't play at that level.
Oh, well,
So-
see, I don't have a copy. I have 5 copies, but okay. All right.
So Dan, I think you're gonna have to continue the conversation down in.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go down there.
Yeah, really. So I want to thank everybody, in particular our speakers, for showing us their bookstore, and I think, like I said earlier, it'll give us a good reason to go down to Richland. The wine is also good down in that area
Yes,
as
very.
well. So there's
We
much-
recommend Fidelitas, the best in the area.
Okay. And I have a guy that in my book group is a physicist, and he has said that the tour of Hanford, I'm not sure which one of the two. He says it's a
He probably
fantastic-
went to the reactor tour.
The
But
reactor
there's also
tour,
a
yeah.
tour of the surrounding area as well, which is kind of neat.
The town
Yeah.
site, the original
Yeah, he
town
said
site.
it's just really terrific. So,
Yeah,
Okay.
I actually took a class on the Manhattan Project in college, so that interests me as well to come down and take the tour because I haven't been down there.
And I actually have artifacts and pieces tied to that.
Hmm.
I have you probably don't know what T plant is, but T plant is where they process the fuel from B reactor.
Okay.
I have a plate from the back of the operating panel there that was put there before they actually processed the first fuel. And I have stuff like that. I have a piece of trinitite sitting there for people to look at.
Right.
And I have to explain to them it's not that radioactive, that orange cup up there with the uranium glaze on it's much scarier.
Fiesta-ware.
I'm
Oh,
gonna,
yeah,
I'd like this, the two, if Stephen and Brian can hold on, I want to just chat with them for a minute.
Mhm.
I could end the meeting for everybody, but if there's anybody else that, has a question, please, now's the time.
Tell them.
Otherwise, you know, you can go ahead and consider this over, for your all standpoint, or you can kind of linger on. It's not, nothing.
Can I say one thing? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
We are, even though our hours say we're only open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, we're here most of the time by chance. It's just
Okay.
we don't guarantee to be here by chance.
We might
Right,
go
but you-
fishing.
just call ahead or what?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you said you had some stuff on the founding of, early history of Richland or that area.
Yeah.
So I was in a law firm when I retired a couple years ago, but, the first name of the firm was Robert Scheffelman, Lawrence Gay and Mock. And I believe Harold Scheffelman drafted the city, charter.
Wow.
Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah, that doesn't, because there were two charters for the city of Richland.
Yeah?
There was the 1920 charter,
No, this was done,
1958.
yeah, and it could have been George Mack. I mean, it was either Harold Scheffelman or George Mack.
Yeah, there was a gentleman that was active in the Kiwanis here locally. His name was Paul Beardsley. And
Okay,
he actually wrote the modern history of, he was the city historian. And we
Yeah.
have his original.
I see his stuff.
his
So anyway,
original
so
stuff.
I just know that I think it was when the federal government gave up a lot of their land, it was, there was, the city was either expanded or rechartered or something at that
Yeah, in
time.
1958, they tried to do it in 53, but because the city owned a cemetery
Uh-huh.
in Washington State, it's illegal for a municipality to run a cemetery. So it took them 5 years to unload the cemetery to transfer.
Yeah,
it
who
over.
wants a cemetery? It's not really a revenue producer.
No, but in 1889, when they wrote the Constitution of the state, one of the special interest groups were the morticians and cemetery owners, and it's in the Constitution.
For God's sake, isn't that crazy? Yeah, wow.
I love stuff like that.
Well, it is. That's really great. Yeah. I think, yeah, I think that was it. I just had that one a little old kind of lawyer connection to the city of Richland. So, okay, well, that was. I want to thank you guys. You have wow, what a place you have. I can see that if you do go online, the stuff could fly out. And it sounds like with this relationship with the Department of Energy, and you get the tours through there. Wow, what a deal! I mean, it's really hard to get traffic.
Yeah, because we're out in the desert. We're not in the main part of town.
That's what I understand.
Yeah, we're surrounded by surveyors and excavation companies and garage door.
Yeah.
And breweries, lots of breweries.
I see. Well, that's great. Well, I want to thank you again. Oh, the other thing I know was another thing is that think about whether there's a possibility of an article for our journal. Stephen, you've been getting copies of the journal, so you know kind of the stuff that we get that we print.
The bookstore gets them, but yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, the last journal that you guys did on the Bigfoot stuff,
Yeah.
really good. I really enjoyed that.
How about that? Wasn't that something?
Now, I did not know, but in retrospect, I am not surprised.
Yeah, that there's so many books out there. Yeah, Gene Body is really great. So anyway, think about it because I can just see the kind of illustrations you can have. I mean, you've given us really a wonderful tour of the history of science fiction today, and it was much appreciated. Great.
Hopefully the photography wasn't too bad.
No, it was good. I mean, but it would be, it's nothing like seeing it in person, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Yeah.
Mhm.